Muchas gracias, Carlos, and also many thanks to Ricardo Becerra for the invitation to speak to you all. Hola a todos. Buenos días from Sydney. Gracias por la invitación, the chance to speak to you at a distance about a subject on which I've worked for many decades, democracia. I want also to say muchas gracias to Denise Dresser and to Mariano Sanchez Talanquier, whose comments, unfortunately, I will not hear live, but will listen to with great interest when the recording is put up for a wider public consumption. So my key topic this morning is democracia. As you all know, it's a tricky word. Everybody is a Democrat these days globally. If we consider democracy as a way of life and as people governing themselves through their chosen and appointed representatives, we can say that democracy is a very special, precious method of defining and handling power, and it is also a whole way of life. Historians teach us that it can be destroyed in quick time, as it was, for example, in 1973 in Chile, when Salvador Allende took his life with the armed forces descending on the presidential palace. Or democracy is destroyed very quickly in military coups d'etats of a kind that have happened more recently in countries such as Thailand and the Sudan. We know from recent worldwide experiences that building a democracy is very hard work. It can take years or even longer for people and their representatives to appreciate its benefits and to learn to live together democratically. In our times, in my work, I have tried to explain why democracy has come to be what I call monitory democracy, democracia monitorizada. What I mean by that is that it is nothing less than the free and fair periodic election of representatives to parliaments and the election of prime ministers and or presidents. But democracy, in my lifetime, globally, has come to mean something much more than free and fair elections. It requires a plethora, a large number of watchdog bodies. We could call them perros guardianes. Watchdog bodies like independent courts, uncorrupted electoral commissions, a robust plurality of media platforms, organizations such as the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, or Médecins Sans Frontières, or bodies like Deforestation Inc. The job of these watchdog bodies, under conditions of monitory democracy, is to ensure that publicly governments are scrutinized, and so is big business scrutinized, and other organizations are scrutinized. And the point of monitory democracy is to ensure that people live democratically, that they choose their representatives, but they are also protected by a whole network of organizations whose job is to blow the whistle on abuse of power, to put a stop to abuse of power and the injustices that follow when power is abusively exercised. If we understand democracy in this rather unusual way as democracia monitorizada, then we can say in these years of the 21st century, democracy is a word that applies to what happens at the upper levels of government. But we can draw the implication from this understanding of democracy that democracy at the upper levels of government, for example, in parliaments and courts, bureaucracies, and so on, can only durably function when citizens down below in everyday life, in the domain of civil society, sociedad civil, can live the norms of equality and freedom, solidarity, and respect for social differences. This is to say that democracy is a whole way of life. It is a forma de vivir, a whole way of life. It's a special form of social interaction and self-expression in which people from different walks of life rub shoulders, see eye to eye, cooperate and compromise, and generally think of themselves as the equals of each other. Democracy, I remind you, is fundamentally about equality and the aspiration to build a more equal society. It is the presumption that nobody is good enough to rule absolutely over others without the consent of people. Seen in this way, democracy is only possible when there is a sociedad civil, a civil society. And a civil society, I want to suggest to you, that is acutely aware, very self-conscious of its ecological foundations. In other words, democracy is only possible when citizens live together non-violently and do so in various social associations and communities, when they treat each other as equals worthy of respect and dignity, as well as understand the need to honor and respect the eco-environments in which they dwell on our planet. Monitory democracy, democracia monitorizada, considered as a whole way of life, has the great advantage, I have tried to say for a long time in my work, it has the great advantage of enabling humans to stand courageously against abuses of power, to be on the lookout for corrupt rulers, demagogues, and fools who bring misery to the lives of people and heap damage upon their ecosystems. This, of course, raises the question, how to protect democracy? The flip side question, why is democracy in trouble in so many contexts, including Mexico, on our planet in these years of the 21st century? The important thing to understand when confronting these questions is that democracy is much more than pressing a button or ticking a box on a ballot paper. It goes well beyond the mathematical certitude of election results and majority rule and lists of minority rights. It is not reducible to lawful rule through independent courts, the rule of law, or attending local public meetings, or participating in street demonstrations, and keeping up with breaking news. Democracy requires all of these conditions. It's very demanding ideal, but it's more than that, because a well-functioning democracy requires freedom from violence, it requires freedom from hunger and personal humiliation of people. Democracy is saying no to the brazen arrogance of callous employers who treat their workers badly as mere commodities and deny them, for instance, the right to form independent trade unions or refuse to pay them sufficient reward to live comfortably. In this respect, monetary democracy is at odds with unregulated, unbridled capitalism. By that I mean profit-hungry, unregulated markets that lead inevitably to the destruction of civil society and its delicate eco-foundations. This is a point made long ago in a classic work by the Hungarian anthropologist and political economist Karl Polanyi. The protection of people and their habitats against predatory power implies as well, of course, the rejection of racism, of misogyny, of religious bigotry, of cruelty against animals, and all other types of human and non-human indignity. Democracy is very much connected, closely connected to dignitat, to dignity. It is also an ethic, which I have tried to explain over the years. It's an ethic of humildad, humility. Democracy is about humility. It's the willingness to admit that we are sometimes wrong, often wrong. It's the willingness to admit as well the impermanence of life. Running through this part of my comments is an abstract, perhaps challenging idea that democracy, when it functions well, sensitizes people to the way time flows through our being. That is to say, democracy sensitizes us to the impermanence of life, the way life, human and non-human, changes. It also sensitizes people to the way that the current situation of their lives can be changed. Democracy denatures power. It encourages people to think that the way things are now are not necessarily the way they must be in the future, that there is no necessity of accepting the status quo as a kind of impermanent given. This means that democracy can operate in all kinds of, its spirit can operate in all kinds of policy areas. For instance, democracy is the refusal of social injustices, such as chronic poverty. When 40% of a civil society lives officially in poverty, this is a degraded, vulnerable civil society and democracy. Democracy is also freedom from fear of police violence. It's the right not to be shot or arrested arbitrarily by soldiers. It's equal access to decent public transport and medical care. It's sympathy for those who have fallen behind. Democracy is, of course, free access to information, and it's also a learned sense of wonder about our world. It's the ability to handle the unexpected. Incertidumbre, uncertainty, incertitude. Democracy is the ability to handle unexpected situations, to be resilient, and to make judgments wisely about who gets how much, when, and how. To live democratically, in other words, is to refuse the dogma that things can't be changed because they are naturally fixed in stone. It's the refusal, for instance, of the view that men are men and women are women, and that violence against women is part of so-called human nature. Democracy, in spirit and substance, rejects this way of thinking. It arouses dissatisfaction with the way things are, with present-day conditions. And democracy is also the friend of hope, hope for a better future, hope that our expectations can be stretched and raised, that people can live better than currently they do live. It follows from this that there are moments when democracy implies the need for insurrection, insurrection. That is, democracy at times requires people to refuse to put up with everyday forms of injustice and hypocrisy, to refuse the demagogue, to refuse bossing and bullying, to refuse poverty, broken hearts, and other forms of social degradation. In these times of rising global uncertainty about the future of democracy, I want to say finally, its friends must pay attention to the reasons why democracy is a good thing. To ask, what are the advantages that come from having institutions, watchdog bodies, free and fair elections, democracy as a whole way of life that pays attention to its eco-environmental conditions? What's so good about democracy understood in this way? ¿Por qué la democracia is the question I want to end on. You may know that in the history of democracy, there have been many reasons given for why democracy is a good thing. The Athenians, those early assembly democrats, typically answered that democracy is a good thing because it makes we, Athenian citizens, militarily strong. It's a very strange, in retrospect, justification of democracy. It's the kind of justification of democracy that George W. Bush tried to resurrect some 2 decades ago. Or there is the view in the history of democracy that democracy is a God-given ideal. Well, there are many believers, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus and others who think that democracy is a good thing because it has a god or the gods on its side. Not everybody believes that, of course. What I've tried to show in my work that there is actually a new 21st century reason for why democracy is a good thing, and why, if it's thrown away, if it's abandoned, if it is allowed to die, people suffer as a consequence. And that reason is that democracy is an unrivaled remedy for preventing the abuse of power by demagogues and despots. That means that democracy is also, as understood in precautionary terms, protecting people against predatory power. That also has a flip side, which is that democracy, when it operates within organizations, within whole polities, is a way of maximizing effective, eficacia, and efficient, eficiencia. It's a way of ensuring that government and other organizations operate more effectively and efficiently. That is, these are new justifications for democracy in our times. It follows from that by implication that when democracy is absent in organizations or in whole polities or in cross-border organizations even, when democracy is absent, those who exercise power tend to abuse it, They tend to make mistakes. They tend to be victims of hubris. They tend to make foolish, unwise decisions that can have very destructive consequences on people's lives. So Democrats in these years of the 21st century need to pay attention to those who are enemies of democracy. And I want to say to you, as I explain in a forthcoming essay in Letras Libres, which will appear in May, that the enemies of democracy in our times include not just army generals, not just backstabbing political operators, and not just populist demagogues, and not just wealthy, power-loving oligarchs. This is a word that Hungarians have invented to describe government officials who profit from business and business people who profit from access to government, oligarchs. These are all enemies of democracy. But democracy is also undermined slowly but surely when a sociedad civil is allowed to degrade. This I have explained with an Indian colleague, is going on in India, the so-called world's largest democracy, where there are many signs of pauperization of millions of people, where more than a third of children go to bed hungry at night because they are insufficiently nourished. Democracy as well is threatened by what I want to call thoughtlessness, inconsciencia, thoughtlessness. Democracy dies a slow motion death. It can die very slowly, not just quickly as in a military coup d'etat, but it can die very slowly. Not only when citizens suffer such miseries as police violence and media lies and rigged elections, or religious intolerance, or unemployment, or food shortages, or homelessness. Democracy also plays dice with its own disappearance when governments and businesses turn a blind eye to environmental catastrophes. What happens in environmental catastrophes, their numbers are growing, is that emergency rule is normalized. There are power grabs that take place, and these have destructive consequences for the spirit and substance of democracy. Being a Democrat in these years of the 21st century requires thought. Thoughtlessness is its enemy. It requires thought about all of these conditions that I have, threats to democracy that I have described, and a new set of threats that include extreme weather events, the extinction of species, crop failures, pestilences, and other environmental emergencies. And here, there's a sting in the tail of what I want to say to you this morning. Democracy, if you think about it, historically, has been typically understood as self-government of the people. It's quite a homocentric norm. It is anthropocentric in the sense that it supposes that people can be masters, lords and ladies, possessors of nature, which is considered to be outside of humans. The rethinking of democracy that is going on in these years of the 21st century has an implication that democracy itself needs to be reimagined. It needs to be redefined. So that democracy is nothing less than free and fair elections, something much more, and that something much more is that people find ways, and must find ways, of preventing abuses of power of humans over other humans, but also democracy now implies, in these years of the 21st century, ways of preventing humans' abuse of the eco-environments upon which they depend and in which they dwell. Well, these are large demands, but the alternative of despotism, of demagoguery, is to be avoided because only destructive consequences can follow from the destruction of democracy. Muchas gracias.